Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim Samach Tet. This week's learning is sponsored by Rivka Isseraf in memory of her mother's first yurtzeit, Gitti Isseraf, Gittel Bat Ravolf Sarah Friedman, sole survivor of her family from Auschwitz. With her Emunah created 3 generations of Torah observant Jews. Today's daf is sponsored by Mark Baker in honor of his wife Shoshana on their 29th wedding anniversary. Marriage is enhanced with daf Yomi in the mix. Love, Mark. Today's daf is sponsored by Shifra Adik in memory of her beloved mother, Sarah Goldwasser, Sarah Nechama Bat Harav Zliel Nechemia, and Fega Rissel on her 16th yurtzeit. We're going to start today with a review of what we saw yesterday. So I'm going to remind you that we started with this question in the middle of Samach Chet Amud Aleph about when the husband, and possibly also we mean the father, which does seem to be so at the end of this, when we get to the final answer, is when they nullify their part of the vow, how is it viewed? Is it viewed as, like, this is in sort of the more learning of the last 100 years, this is more called like a chakira, okay? It's basically where the Gemara says the chakira itself, which is, how does this exactly work? Are we basically, right, there's 2 ways to view this. Are we saying that the neder is 50% removed, like the entire 50% portion is removed, and what's left is 50% of the neder, which would mean, as the Gemara brought yesterday, this example of the woman vowed against 2 olives, and then the husband nullified his half. The father did not nullify his. So do we say when she eats both olives that she ate an olive of Isur? Okay, because the father's neder was fully there. It was just the husband's half wasn't in place. And since she ate 2 and half was still forbidden, she ate the half that was forbidden. Or do we say, no, miklash kalish, the whole vow is just weakened. So then with the hafara of the husband, when he nullifies it, he's basically weakening the entire vow and the whole thing. And so he doesn't have access to only 50%. He has access to the whole thing. On the other hand, he doesn't have the full capability to undo it himself. So he just weakens the vow. So when she then goes and eats, she's just eating something that's half asur, but not that half of it is asur. It's asur for her to do because her vow wasn't fully nullified, but it was not a full vow. It wasn't in full power because it was a weakened vow. And then she wouldn't get lashes for that because you don't get lashes for a weakened isur, okay, for a prohibition that's weakened. That was our question. To answer the question, we brought this very complicated Tosefta that is coming to explain the next Mishnah about the power the father has more than the husband, which we talked a lot about because the more natural fit is that the father's the one who's nullifying her vow at this in-between point when she's betrothed. Again, you have to remember, it's only a woman who's betrothed when she's still a na'ara. If she's a bogeret, then she's already out of her father's domain. But we're talking about in this stage where she's either a minor still, or she's in the 6-month period after becoming of age. And then both have rights, but the father has more rights. And what are the main way the father has more rights? Well, if something happens to the husband, right, he's no longer in the picture, then the father gets the rights of the husband. So the Gemara brought these 4 cases to discuss when it works, when it doesn't work, and also explaining both how the husband doesn't get the rights of the father and the father does get the rights of the husband. So I want to review these 4 cases again, starting from Samach Chet Amud Bet at the top. The first case, okay, and we'll go through the way the Ran explains each case about what's unique about each case. So the first is the father hears, he nullifies the vow, but the husband hadn't even heard of the vow. And then the father dies. So now just the husband is left. The father has nullified. But since the husband hadn't heard the vow and didn't nullify when the father was still alive, we basically say, Me'ta'ab lo nitrokna reshut labal. What we basically, according to the Ran, he views this as if whatever was done before the death of the father is basically wiped out. Okay? It's canceled. It's not relevant because you need them to do it kind of at the same, in some way together. And he doesn't explain exactly why this doesn't work, but he basically says, even though, like that's the big chiddush here, even though the father already kind of undid his 50%, and you think maybe the husband now can undo his 50%, that's the way we would have looked at it. No, it doesn't work. Since the father dies in the middle, basically we view it as if he did nothing. In the opposite case, though, if the husband heard, nullified it, and then The father doesn't hear until the husband dies. This, even though, right, in the previous case, we said it's as if it's nullified. In this case, the father basically inherits the rights of the husband. Okay, despite the fact, and this is what we're going to see later, that despite the fact that maybe the husband weakened the vow, and maybe there's not enough power, and this is what we're going to talk about in another case, that if it's weakened, there's not enough power to actually give it to the whatever's left. There's not enough to kind of pass it over to the other side. In this case, it doesn't matter. Okay, because again, why doesn't it matter? Because really, okay, if we go back to the ritva, what we saw yesterday, the husband is just an added. He gets a little extra power or a little extra. What do you say? He's like an appendage to the whole story. Okay, an accessory. He's added. His rights are added to the father's basic rights. So really, the father had rights all along. So the fact that the husband dies, it all reverts back to the father. Now, the third case is the husband hears, he nullifies the vow. The father hadn't heard anything, and then the father dies. Now, in this case, it's much simpler than everything. I'm in the last words of yesterday's daf. In this case, the father did nothing, and then the father died. So the father, in the first case with the husband, where the father dies, the father had already annulled the vow. So there was at least, again, it didn't work anyway, but there was at least a thought that maybe it would work because the father already did his share. In this case, the father did nothing. And again, we're referring to vows that happened when the father was still alive. Once the father dies and the woman is only then in the husband's domain. So if she takes a vow after the death of the father, the husband will have full rights. But we're talking about a vow she took when the father was still alive. So if the father hadn't heard the vow and the father hadn't nullified the vow, of course the husband can't do anything because he can only annul the vow with partnership, okay, with the father. And the father did nothing, didn't even know about the vow. So of course, there's nothing to talk about. Case number 4 is at the top of our daf. And here we're going to have a debate. Shama aviha veheferma. So now in the flip of the previous case, the father hears, nullifies the vow. And the husband hadn't heard anything about the vow. And in the meantime, the husband dies. Now this you would think would be obvious based on what we saw previously. Everything reverts to the father, right? And that's exactly what the Tosefta says. So the father now goes back. It's a little bit of a strange language, goes back here and nullifies the portion of the husband. What it means here is the father's original nullification is in place, and the husband's half now goes to the father without an issue. Okay, that would be simple. However, Rabbanit comes in the Tosefta and says, Hein divrei Beit Shamai. Okay, where he says about this Tosefta. I actually didn't check whether this is in the words of the Tosefta or it's added. He says, these are the words of Beit Shamai. Beit Hillel omrim ein yachol lahafil. Beit Hillel disagrees. And he says, in this case, you don't say nitrokna reshut la'av. The father, right? You empty out all the rights onto the father. He does not have rights here. Why? So now we're going to see. And this is going to be the answer to our question. Shma mina, from here you can infer what? Le Beit Shamai meigaz gayiz. Now we have our answer. Beit Shamai holds when, and here it seems like it's also the father, when the father nullified the vow, okay? He nullified meigaz gayiz, he nullified 50%, the entire 50%. So he did that before the husband heard about it and before the husband died. Then what's left? 50%, a full 50%. So when the husband dies, what did we learn? Nitrokna reshut la'av. So all the rights of the husband, the 50% that's left, go back to, right? The father basically, we're going to see the words of the Rava, we're not going to see it inside, but he actually uses the words of inheritance, horish. He passes it on in inheritance to the father. However, why does Beit Hillel say this doesn't work? Because Beit Hillel holds the Beit Hillel miklash kalish. According to Beit Hillel, he weakens it. So now let's go and figure out what the problem is. If we have this vow, father hears about it, nullifies it. What does he do? He weakens the entire vow. So not 50% erased. He basically weakens the entire vow. And then we have what's left, a weakened vow. So when the husband dies, the Ran says it in these kind of words, he says there's not enough power in this neder that's left to be able to pass it on in inheritance to the father, because it's a weakened vow. When you say 50%, 50%, so his 50% he gives over to the other side. That's Beit Shamai. According to Beit Hillel, no. He doesn't have, how does this differ from the first case? The first case was the husband had already nullified his part. And then, right, what happened? The husband died. So then what's left? The father's part is left. Well, he doesn't need to pass that part on to anyone. So the father's part is left. And what the husband did basically goes to the father. That's fine. But in this case, the father didn't do anything. In this case, the husband didn't do anything, and he has to pass on his portion to the father. And as opposed to the first case where he had already nullified it. In this case, he has to pass it on, and it's not enough. He doesn't have enough. In order to pass something on, it has to be significant. This is just a weakened vow. So he can't pass on his half because it's not really his half. It's just a weakened vow. And he doesn't have the power to be able to do that. And therefore, according to Beit Hillel, the father cannot nullify this kind of vow. Okay? It's hard to understand conceptually. It's not an easy concept here. And again, that's the Ran's explanation. I'm sure there's other explanations as well. But that's the way the Ran explains it, that it makes sense from the pshat here, that it's weakened, and because it's weakened, he can't actually pass it on. So there's our answer, which our answer ends up being, it's a debate between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Now we're going to have 5 questions. We're going to answer all of our 5, we're going to answer 4 of our questions, and the 5th question we're going to be left with is kind of going to be continued. It's going to be a question upon a question upon a question, and then we'll get to an answer in tomorrow's daf. So there's a little bit of a problem with who's asking these questions. It's some say Rava, some say Raba. It could be they're all Rava. It's a little bit confusing. There's a problem with the manuscripts because often they wrote Resh Bet, Chupchik, it's one of those little things shortened, and then they don't know, is it Rava or Raba? The significance would be that we're going to see a lot of the questions were asked by one of them and answered by a statement the other one made. And it would make more sense to say that Rava, who is the generation below Raba, asked Rava with an aleph, asked the question, and Raba with a hey answered it. In other words, not that he answered it because it's not brought as someone asked a question, someone answered it. It's that somebody brings the answer from something that Raba had said. So it's likely that it was the younger one asked the question and the answer is brought from something the older one said. So that's why we're going to go in general with Rava asked the question and Raba answered it. But it's not clear in all the cases if that's the case. And you'll see the first question is just Rava and Rabbi Yochanan answers the question, but later we're going to get to the more confusing which word it is, which rabbi it is. But it's not as significant in terms of the content. So let's focus more on the content. By Rava. Rava asked the following question. And all these questions are going to be about, let's get our terminology, Kiyum haneder and hafarat haneder. If you remember, the husband has, I would say really 3 options, okay, or the father. It doesn't really matter who we're talking about here. 2 or 3 options when he hears about the woman. Either silence, which we're not going to talk about, silence, which we're basically going to mean if the whole entire day passes and they're silent, we're going to say that must be kiyum. It was this ratifying the vow. But let's talk about kiyum and hafara. Kiyum is saying, this is a good vow. I'm keeping this vow. I'm agreeing that my wife vowed this and it's good, or my daughter. And hafara is saying, I'm annulling this vow, or nullification of the vow. So now Rava asks the following question. Yesh she'ela b'hakem, o ein she'ela b'hakem. Now all of a sudden we're mixing 2 different things. There's she'ela, which is a regular vow. When you want to undo the vow, you can go do she'elat chacham. By the way, even if the husband, it's actually a good question, can she do, I assume she could do she'ela in any case. But now, what if he did kiyum haneder can he undo his kiyum neder and say, listen, I established this vow, but, I didn't realize, blah, 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 blah. Can he undo that? Im timtzalomer yesh she'ela b'hakem, and if you want to say can do that, yesh she'ela b'hafel or ein she'ela b'hafel. Can you undo your nullification? Right? How much does hafara, right? How strong is she'ela? Can we undo anything we did? So let me talk about this, and I wanted to address what you just asked, Miriam, which is if we say you can undo, let's start with the first part. You can undo the ratification of the neder. So then what happens? So then you're back to square one, where the woman has a neder. Then you can come in and do hafara. If you don't do hafara, then it's still going to be a neder. You would have to do, let's say he did kiyum first, ratified it. Then he would have to go to a chacham and say, I really didn't mean to, for whatever reason. And he would have to give his reason. If it was accepted, then he could undo it. And then he would do hafara. Now, here comes in a big question. When is all this happening? Does it all have to happen in the first day? Because remember, he can only nullify the vow on the first day, the day he hears about it. So the Ran says here that we're obviously talking about that he would have to do the she'ela on the day of so that he could nullify it on the day of. But not all the commentaries agree. Some of them say no. Let's say it's a week later, he goes and undoes the kiyum, and as long as he does the nullification on the day he undoes the kiyum, that's considered bo bayom that day. So there's a big debate about when this can actually happen. Does it all have to happen within the first day, or can it actually happen later? Then you're asking if she'ela with charata or petach. It doesn't specify here. If you remember, there were some sugyas where we said there's certain times where you can, you can't use one or the other. But it doesn't specify it here. I would assume it could be using either one. I'm not sure. So now the Gemara wants to know, the second question is, and this is a more interesting question in my mind, can you undo hafara or not? Okay, now it's interesting. It's an interesting question because theoretically, you have to think about why they even allow hatarat nedarim in general. And until now, from what we've been learning, it seems like they allow hatarat nedarim because they really want to get people out of the neder. They want to give you options to get out of it. Now, if you undo the nullification, you're actually putting the neder back into place, which is really not the reason why they instituted hatarat, or maybe we don't know, right? We have no idea why they put in hatarat. But if you want to go in the direction that it's really there to undo the vows and not to establish them, then we wouldn't really allow she'ela when it comes to hafara, because that's going in the opposite direction. That's actually making the neder, giving it more significance. That's if we go with all these approaches that we saw in the Gemara. Again, there are different approaches, but the gist of the Gemara has been, we don't really like these vows and we're happy to try to figure out ways to get rid of them. So our answer actually matches that, and then you have to really ask, what were they thinking when they asked this question? It's an interesting question in general. There was something I read. I just want to sit for a minute. Right. The reason, now I remember, the reason why people think that if you say there's she'ela by kiyum, then there would also be she'ela b'hafara, is because we're going to see this later, they make a hekesh between kiyum and hafara, because it says in the pasuk, either he's mekayem or he's meifel. So because of that, the question is, how far do we take the hekesh? Does it apply across the board? So once you say this is true for this, well, then it'll be true for that. Once there's she'ela and kiyum, then there would be she'ela and hafara. To which the Gemara answers, Tashma, let's learn it to Amar Rabbi Yochanan. I think some people say Amar Raba. I think there's different gersot here, but anyway, let's stick with the content. Nishalim al ha'ikem ve'en nishalim al ha'ifel. So, by the way, I want to just point out that some of the answers are going to come from Amoraim and some are going to come from Tanaitic sources, which is just interesting in terms of, right, sometimes we end up with a slew of questions that are all from Tanaitic sources or proofs that are all from Amoraim. This is going to be a mix. So here we have an Amora who says that you can undo your ratification, but you cannot undo the nullification. So there's your answer, which fits in with the logic that I described before. Second question by Rava. We're going to read this as if Rava asked the question with an aleph. Okay, I want to point out that the next bunch of cases, and they're going to get more ridiculous as they go on, ridiculous in the sense that did somebody really say this? Like, would this be a real case? And honestly, my way of viewing this is that these are not real actual cases, at least for the most part. We're going to see as we go on, but they're really getting at the conceptual issues here about your words, what they mean, what you said, what you didn't say, what we can fill in, what we can't fill in. And they're more theoretical questions. So yes, if you undo your hafara, then the neder is actually valid, right? If you undo your kiyum, then it just opens the door to be able to do nullification. Okay, so that's the difference really between them. So again, undoing your nullification means the neder is valid. Undoing the ratification would mean that it's just neutral at this point, because kiyum basically does not allow you then to do hafara. So in order, you'd have to do 3 stages then: kiyum, she'ela, and then hafara. So Rava asked the following question: Kiyem l'chi. What if you said it twice? You said, I establish it. Why do you need to? You don't need to. This is the point. This is not a realistic question. Probably most people would never say this. But if you said it twice, is this considered 2 kiyumim? Now, what's the relevance? Well, if we're going to see it right now, I'll read it inside. Tashma, let's learn from here. Raba. In the case where you said, I ratify this, and then you went and said, I want to undo my ratification, then, well, since you ratified it twice, you got rid of one ratification, but you're still left with another one. So if you want to actually nullify the vow, you would have to get rid of the second ratification as well. So that's obviously the relevance of the question. If you said kiyem l'chi, and you got rid of one, right? Is this 2 kiyumim or not? Okay, so if you undo the first one, would you have to undo the second one as well in order to allow you then to do the nullification of the vow? Third question, by Raba or Rava. Kiyem l'chi umufar l'chi. Here's a really complicated one. You say itself in the opposite. Okay, why would you do that? So first of all, we've seen all sorts of cases. We're going to actually quote another case where this happens in the laws of Tamura, which we'll talk about soon. If you said, I'm going to establish this, I'm going to ratify it, and I'm going to nullify. So now you're saying itself in the opposite. So what did you mean? If you remember, we've learned sometimes before, tfos lashon rishon, or af b'gmar dvarav adam nitpas, right? If you said something and then changed it, there's this debate. Do we go by the first thing you said and we assume anything you said after that is irrelevant? Or do we assume that the second part of what you said was correcting the first part? Okay, maybe you're like stuttering, I want to do this, and then you change your mind, you say, I want to do that. It's very unclear how to read this. But in this case, now, the problem is that once you establish something, we already learned, you can't nullify it. Because if you ratified the vow, in order to nullify it, then you would have to undo your ratification. So if the kiyum applies first, there's no room for the hafara, for the nullification. But if the nullification kicks in first, then the vow is gone and your kiyum is irrelevant. So the question is, which one kicks in? But the thing is this: you didn't just say kiyem l'chi umufa l'chi. If you said that, it's very likely we'd say, look, you already said kiyem first, that's done, and then therefore there's nothing you could do after this. The vow is a vow. But you then added the words v'lo techol. Again, this is why it's kind of ridiculous that someone would actually say this. V'lo techol hakama ela im ken chala hafara. So first of all, I see you're asking, Amy, that isn't the intent important? Of course the intent's important. The problem is we don't know what the intent was. We're trying to figure out, what did this person mean by what they said? So, right, you could say, let's ask them, but maybe they can't answer, for whatever reason, they're not here, right? Let's say the husband walks off after this, and then we want to know, is her vow a vow or not? So now, lo techol hakama ela im ken chala hafara. But you added the following words. The man added these words. The hakama, the ratification, is not going to apply unless the nullification kicks in, which is in other words, what they're basically saying here is you have 2 things pulling. In the first part of your sentence, you started with kiyem as if that should be first. But then you said, but the kiyem is not going to apply unless the hafara applies. And if you take the kiyum first, well, then the hafara won't apply. So therefore, maybe what you meant to say was, even though I started with kiyum, maybe the hafara is really the main thing that I'm meaning to say. So it's very, yes, I agree with you, Gita. This is a very confusing set of questions. Okay, mahu. So now the Gemara wants to know, what is the case? To which they answer, Tashma mi plukte de Rabbi Meir of Rabbi Yossi. Turning now to Amud Bet. We can learn it from the machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. In the end, we're going to say, even though there's a machloket about this, they're both going to agree in this case. Ditnan, as it says in the following Mishnah. Okay. We have to learn about laws of substitution. We mentioned them before, but I'll mention them again. Once we get to the Gemara of Tmura, you'll remember them very well. We'll see them a lot. These are laws of substitution. What happens is I designate an animal for my sacrifice, and then I change my mind. And I say, you know what, I want a different animal. Even if I want a nicer animal, or maybe I want an uglier animal because I want to save that nice animal for myself. Whatever reason it is, it doesn't matter. Im tovi imra, the pasuk says, whether you're bringing a nicer one or a less nice one, it doesn't work. Okay, what does it mean it doesn't work? It actually does work, but we're going to see what that means. It doesn't work and it does work. What it means is you can't substitute another animal in its stead. Your first animal, you designated, that's done. You can't undo it. Right? We see lots of times you could do pidyon, redeem things, not when it's an animal for a sacrifice. You designate this animal for a sacrifice, it can't be changed. However, if I say I'm substituting this for that, the substitution is effective. Okay. It means even though it's forbidden for me to do this, if I do it, both animals are hu utmurato yeh kadosh. It, right, the first animal and the substituted animal are all sanctified. That's the basics. Now, what if you said the following? Okay, let's first describe the situation. You have three animals in front of you. One is an ola already, you designated for a burnt offering. One is a shlamim, a peace offering. And the third one is nothing yet. And the third one is the one that you're using now to substitute in place of one or maybe both of these animals. So you say the following statement. This is in place of the burnt offering. This is in place of the peace offering. Very confusing statement. So in the beginning, it seems like, well, it can't be both, right? One animal is substituting for one animal. So what does Rabbi Meir say? This goes by the classic Divrei Rabbi Meir. This is Rabbi Meir, meaning we go by the first thing you said. First you said, Ola, so we're going to go by that. Because once you made it an Ola, it can't be a Shlamim also, right? Just like once you did the ratification, you can't nullify it. So we're going to go by the first thing you say. If that's what he really meant, if he really meant the first one, then I would agree with you. But what's the issue? You can't really say, okay, you know how we say that Shamor v'Zachor b'dibor echad, God said them both in the same mouthful? Humans can't do that. So you made this statement, and what you really wanted to do was, this animal is shlamim and ola, but you couldn't say shlamim and ola at the exact same moment. So therefore, what did you do? You said one after the other. It doesn't mean one is more significant than the other. So actually, they're both kayamim. Now, how can it both be kayamim? How can you take this one animal? You can't split in half, sacrifice half of it for an ola, half for a shlamim. No. So what do? In this case, we say this animal is sanctified for an ola and a shlamim, but we can't sacrifice it for both. So because when you slaughter, you already have to have in mind what sacrifice you're doing it for. The intent is super important, what your thoughts are, the thoughts of the person sacrificing it, slaughtering it, all that. So what do? You wait till the animal gets a blemish. This is a very common thing we're going to see many, many times over in our learning of Shas. It's called Yir'eh ad sheyistev. You leave it to graze in a certain area until it gets a blemish. Once it gets a blemish, at that point, it can be redeemed. Remember, I told you, an animal designated for a sacrifice can't be redeemed. Wasn't totally true. Unless it gets a blemish, it can't be brought as a sacrifice. Then you redeem it, and then you split the money. Half goes for an ola sacrifice, and half goes for a shlamim. So that's what you do with this animal, according to Rabbi Yossi. Now, let's start with Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is very clear. When you said, what you meant really was that they both should apply at the same time. Okay, now, if they're both going to apply at the same time, and you said, lo techul hakama elim ken chala hafara, you're basically saying, I want to make sure the hafara happens first. So basically, it's going to be, right, we can take everything you said. We don't say we go by the beginning. We take it all, and you seem to give precedence to the hafara. That means it's going to be nullified. And what about Rabbi Meir? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, they didn't even need to explain. It was obvious. Afilu Rabbi Meir lo ka'amal, to lo amal lo techul zo ela im ken chala zo. When Rabbi Meir said his statement, it was only when you said, this is ola, this is shlamim. But you didn't say, I don't want it to be ola unless it's also going to be shlamim, right? You didn't say those words. But in our case, here, but when you took the first one, hakama, and you said, well, this is predicated on the fact that I want to make sure the hafara is applicable, applies, then in that case, Rabbi Meir nami moded the hafara. Even Rabbi Meir would agree in our case that the hafara would be because of that condition he put in. Okay, so that's the answer to our question, that according to both opinions, we can learn from their machloket that in our case, they would both agree since he added that second line. If he didn't add the second line, it would be a debate. Or, is it the second? And then if it's the second, are they equal? Or do we say hafara is more? We don't know. By Raba. And here's the question. What if you say, kiyem umufar lechi bevat achat mahu? Okay, now there's a big debate what the language here, where you put the quotation marks. Is this kiyem umufar lechi, where you said it's established, right? I'm ratifying and I'm nullifying. Okay, and then bivat echad, we're going to assume he means, right, that I want this to all happen at the same time. Or some people say he actually said the words, and some people even add kiyem lechi umufar lechi bivat echad. That he was very clear. I want this to be both ratified and nullified at the same time. Okay, so either bivat echad is in his words, or since he said kiyem umufar lechi, lechi is to you, and since he didn't say kiyem lechi, mufar lechi, as if they're two separate things, but he said this and this is to you, it's as if it's bivat echad. Okay, so whether he said bivat echad or he didn't say bivat echad, meaning all that should all happen at the same time, but the intent was all at the same time. So then what? Okay, where one really didn't precede the other. So Tashma, here's the answer, a very interesting answer to this question. Ta'amal Raba, or maybe, probably the question was Rava, and here the answer is Raba. I'm taking out the word davar because the Bach says to take it out. It doesn't really matter, though, whether it's in or whether it's out. Kol she'eno bezeh achar zeh. If they wouldn't work one after the other, which we already know they won't work, right? If you nullified, you can't ratify anymore. And if you ratified, you can't nullify anymore, right? Unless you did she'ela, which we talked about, but that's not what's going on here. Since they can't work one after the other, afilu bevat achat eino, it doesn't even work at the same time. Okay? Where did he say this? This is an interesting case, and maybe you'll understand this concept better once you see the case. So if you look at a few lines from the bottom of the Ran, Upashtina lamid Raba, Damar beperik isha mekadesh. It's in the case about kiddushin. Someone who's mekadesh shte achayot ke'echad. He betroths two sisters at the same time. So now, do we say you can't betroth two sisters because it's harayo, right? So if you betroth one sister first and then you betroth the second one, the second betrothal wouldn't be valid. The first one would still be valid. What if you did them both at the same time? So do you have to worry that there's safek kiddushin and he basically has to divorce them both? Or do you say it was a meaningless action? So Raba basically says, let's go back to the words in the Gemara. Kol she'eino bezeh achar zeh, since one after the other, the second one wouldn't be valid. So therefore, afilu bevat achat eino. If you do them at the same time, it's a meaningless action. Therefore, what happens here? Exactly like you said, it's like plus one, minus one. Okay, you basically done zero. So if you do kiyem lechi and mufar lechi bevat achat, I want this all to happen at the same time, you're basically at where you started. It's a meaningless action whatsoever. Okay, so only in the previous case, because you basically said, I'm saying that the hakama can only be valid if the hafara is valid, you're basically giving precedence to the hafara, and therefore it's going to be the nullification that works. But if you say they're both happening at the same time, it doesn't work. Last question for today, as I know these questions are confusing. When I studied this, also prepared it, your head's spinning a little bit. By Raba, it's a good kind of thing when you have a daf where your head's spinning with all the cases. It helps, and this is what works for me. You go back to it later, and you look at it later if you have the time. I know with daf yomi you don't always have the time, but if you look at it a second time, it usually ends up kind of settling a little bit. The confusion settles as you've already learned it, and then it makes it clearer. Like there's sometimes we could learn something over and over and over with Gemara. It's often like that, and then eventually, after you've gone over it a few times, it kind of, all of a sudden, now everything starts making sense. So I know you don't always have time for that in Daf Yomi, but anyway, maybe we'll do a quick review at the end of the class. Okay, by Raba, last question for today, and this we don't have an answer to. Kiyem lechi hayom mahu. What if I say, or the husband says, I'm ratifying this for today? Now, the assumption of this question, or a presumption, is that if the husband says, I am ratifying this today, but nullifying it tomorrow, that actually works. Okay, until now, we said you can't ratify and nullify at the same time, but you can give it a time frame and say, I want this neder that you made is going to be valid for a day or for a week, and after that, it will be nullified. That works, okay? And then it will be valid for the first few days, whatever you said, and it will be nullified after. But what if you left off the second part of that sentence? This is a classic. You just didn't say it, but you meant it, or maybe you didn't mean it. So if you say, I'm ratifying this for today, does that mean, and I'm nullifying it for tomorrow or not? Okay, you didn't say it. Miyam rinan. Do we say, Kimanda amarla mufer lechila machal? It's as if you said, it's nullified for tomorrow. O dilma halo amarla, or you didn't say that. So it might not be ratified for tomorrow, but it's also not nullified tomorrow. Now, obviously, tomorrow comes, you can't nullify it anymore because it's past the day that you heard. So then the neder would actually be valid. So the question is, what do we do? And as I told you earlier, that this last question, we're going to have a bunch of, and if you say this, here's my next question. If you say that, here's my next question, until they try to answer it at the end. Okay, so what we did today was we first finished up that Tosefta to answer our question about miklash kalish or meigaz gayiz. Is it cut off entirely when you do the nullification, your half? Do we view it as there's two halves of her vow? Or, which again, would only be relevant in very unique cases where there would be actually ramifications, as we saw with the two olives, or do you weaken it? Okay, and then this weakening we saw also has effects in other cases, and that's how we learned this, like for example, if one of them dies. So, okay, that's that. Then we saw basically it's machloka Beit Shamai Beit Hillel, each one understands it differently. Then we started with our questions. The first one was easy. Can you undo kiyum neder, the ratification? The answer was yes. Can you undo the nullification? No. Then we asked if you did the two languages. That was also pretty easy, right? Kiem. So did you mean two kiyumim? And therefore, if you undo one, you still have to undo the other before you can nullify or not? Because again, remember, ratifying needs undoing, and only then can you nullify it. Then we got complicated with this kiyum lechi umufer lechi. If you start with the language of kiyum, move to mufal, which then basically means if we really start with kiyum, you can't ever nullify it because your kiyum is put in place unless you undo the kiyum, which is not what they're talking about here. And then, but you added this condition that the kiyum is only going to kick in, the ratification, as long as the nullification can kick in. So you basically sounded like you were giving significance to the nullification, which is in the end what we paskin, that it's true. You made the nullification significant because you said, basically, even though you started with the language of kiyum, what you really meant to say is, I want both of these to happen, but I want the hafara to happen first, which basically means, right, obviously the big question to be asked is, why did you say kiyum? Because the kiyum is never going to happen in that case. So we don't know why you said this. You said a very strange language. Maybe you were trying to be confusing for some reason. We really don't know. And that's why, again, this is really theoretical and that's why it's interesting they're comparing this, because this happens in other cases as well, where somebody will say something that's confusing. And the question is where the first part contradicts the second part, or the second part contradicts the first. And the question is, how do we know what to go by? So if it's just part one contradicts, part two contradicts part one. So then we have this basic machloket. Usually, do we go by the first thing you say, or do we go by the last thing? Do we assume since you added something, you obviously meant the whole thing, and maybe you wanted them both to happen at the same time, you just couldn't say them all at the same time. But right, that's a basic machloket. But in our case, it's not the basic machloket, because in our case, you basically specified that you really are giving precedence to the nullification. And that's why that's the one that's going to kick in. Fourth question was, I hope this is now more clear. Fourth question is, if you say, I want these both to happen at the same time, and you're very clear without giving precedence to any one of them, you've basically done nothing. Okay, it's a zero-sum game. You basically said this and the opposite, and you're basically back at square one. So again, if it's the same day, he could still go ahead and either be mekayim neder or either ratified or nullified. Remember, if he doesn't ratify it and he doesn't nullify it, it will eventually be ratified when the day ends, because he has that one day to do it. That's what I talked about at the beginning of the class. Shtika, if he's just silent, then it's basically ratification. But if he does ratify it, it precludes him from nullifying it. Okay, that's what's important. And especially if there's a father and a husband, that's what we learned. If one ratifies, the other can't nullify anymore. So that's the importance of the ratification, even though theoretically you don't really need ratification, because just doing nothing is going to end up being ratification. But we're obviously talking about in the first day where it is significant. And then our last question was, you say, Kiem lechi hayom, which sounded like I want to ratify it for today, but not for tomorrow, meaning you really want to nullify it for tomorrow, but you didn't actually say you want to nullify it for tomorrow. Do we assume you meant that and just didn't say it, or not? Or look, you didn't say it. We can't say it's nullified if you didn't actually use any language of nullification and you didn't say that. So we don't know yet the answer to that question. We'll wait for tomorrow. Hope that summary was helpful, and wishing everyone a good day.